To you from failing hands, we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high.
Today on No Nonsense, service, courage, and sacrifice at home, around the world, and across the generations. Every November 11th each year, we pause to remember that we actually do live in the land of the free because of the brave who served and sacrificed. Tim Cook, prolific and award-winning author and Canada's foremost military historian, the Canadian War Museum, joins us again this year for some thoughts as we mark this important time of year. 100 years, Tim, since this country, since Canada adopted the poppy as our symbol of remembrance. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. It is 100 years, and it's such an iconic symbol, isn't it? And it almost feels like it's always been with us. And I think those of us who are not over 100 years old, that's the case. And yet,
True.
of course, it has its own history. And it is a history that is grounded in the Great War, the First World War from 1914 to 1918, that terrible slaughter that forever changed world history, and where Canada, as you mentioned, stepped up with over 620,000 Canadians who served in that war. And we were only a country of 8 million. So that was 1 in 3 adult males who served, a generation that passed through the trial by fire there. The Canadian Corps, our primary fighting force, victories at Vimy and Hill 70 and Passchendaele and the 100 Days campaign, but paying a terrible cost. We stepped out onto the world stage and we were recognized for that. And yet, of course, there was such tremendous sorrow and grief in Canada. And so where does the poppy come from? Well, it comes from the poem, that poem that we know, the poem, Senator, I know you probably memorized in your youth.
We all did.
That's right. And my 3 daughters, they have memorized it too. So it's something that continues forward. And of course, your listeners will know it is from John McCrae, the Canadian physician who was from Montreal. He was a gifted poet. And in fact, he was a South African war veteran. I always find it interesting. John McCrae, he's sometimes portrayed as almost this prophet of peace or poet of peace, but he was a Canadian of that time, and he believed in the justness of the cause in the war, which was to stand by Britain, which was to serve Canadian national interests of the day as they were defined, and as we should not forget, to help liberate the French and the Belgians, because Germany had invaded and occupied about 90% of Belgium and about 10% of France. And we sometimes forget that in the horrible slaughter and the death, that it was a war of liberation to some degree.
You have raised so many points that I want to touch on. Let me start first and foremost, because it warms my heart that your 3 daughters in school are still learning in Flanders Fields.
That's right. It's such an evocative poem, and I'm really thrilled that they still memorize it. They try to understand those words, and it goes back to 1915. That's when it was first published by John McCrae, the poet, physician, soldier, as we were talking about, and it became a worldwide phenomenon. I mean, it's difficult to think about what is another cultural object in a poem or a song that the whole world was talking about and memorizing and speaking.
What was it? What was it? I mean, it is a brutal poem. It is his work is infiltrated with the images of the dead. He wasn't trying to make war, a pleasant thought, or weren't the soldiers off having a wonderful time abroad. I mean, it was ugly.
It was, and he was in the ugliness. He was at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. That's when the Germans unleashed the first chlorine gas attack in the history of warfare. The Canadians faced that, choking, gasping, fighting often to the last bullet. And John McCrae was there as a surgeon. And we think of our frontline caregivers today in the current pandemic. Well, he was in it operating for about 15 days straight. He writes of his deep exhaustion, the horrors that he saw, and yet he continued to save lives as the soldiers were brought in, as he operated on them in a dugout, horrible conditions. And in one of those brief moments of break, he left the dugout, the smell of carnage and blood, and he wrote his famous poem. And as you say, it's about the dead who are calling upon the living. To you from failing hands we throw, the torch be yours to hold it high. We remember that. We remember the opening lines, but it's about the dead keeping up the fight.
Yeah.
And I think the genius in the poem, and of course, during the war, it was used in recruiting and it was used to sell victory bonds. The genius, though, is that after the war, of course, and McCrae did not survive the war. He died of disease. He died. He had what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder from the sights he had seen. He didn't survive, but his poem did. And the genius in the poem, I would argue, is how it becomes an object of remembrance. The dead are no longer imploring us to keep up the fight. They're telling us we must remember.
Yeah. He died in 1918. This is a young man from Guelph, Ontario. Again, it puzzles me how it grabbed the world. Those are not days where there was Twitter or a poem went out or a book was published, and for it to resonate in so many places. And then the activities of the French woman who took up that symbol of the poppy and started to use it to both remember and to rebuild.
That's right. Yeah, and it's a great question. You're getting to the heart of it. How did this one poem, of course, this is a war where there were tens of thousands of poems that were published. That was one of the primary means by which people expressed themselves.
Yeah.
It's the age before, I'll be basic here, before the internet, before television, before radio,
yes.
Right. And so it's a newspaper war and it's a poetry war. And we know that. But there was something about that poem that resonated both with soldiers. They studied it. They memorized it. They said it in the trenches. I've read, as you know, thousands and thousands of letters from soldiers home. They write home to their mothers and fathers, to their kid brother or kid sister, to their wives, to their girlfriends, to their children, and they write about that poem. There's something in it that resonates with that generation. And it is, I think, the fact, as you said, it's a brutal poem. It's about keeping up the fight. And yet there's something about the dead who are speaking to the living and the obligations and the duty. And again, but a key part of that is the poppy, of course.
Yeah.
In Flanders fields, the poppies blow. Between the crosses, row on row. We all know that, but the poppy becomes really important as a symbol. And after the war, of course, it was an identifiable symbol on the battlefields as the poppies grew wild. And then after the war, so if we skip ahead, victory in November of 1918 on the Western Front, the world is remade. There are 9 million battlefield dead, about 21 million battlefield wounded, countless millions of civilians who suffer through death and maiming and genocide. New countries are made. We see communism given birth in Russia, the rise of the United States as a great power, and of course, Canada, fundamentally changed by this war. And yet the dead from in Flanders Fields continue to call out about the obligation of remembrance, commemoration. And the poppy seems to encapsulate that. And in
go ahead.
No, but just in 1921, the Great War Veterans Association, which is a sort of a precursor to the Royal Canadian Legion, they adopt it. And going forward, we begin to wear it for a whole number of reasons.
It has these other symbolic issues because there's always the battle about the white poppy to symbolize peace, and the Legion being very firm and veterans being very firm and saying it's not about that. Warriors is what brought us. That is who fought for our freedom. But it was, even back at the time, a very powerful political symbol in Canada through an election in 1917, the issue of conscription, English versus French, an interesting part of our story.
Well, one of the most divisive elections in our history. And I know, Senator, you've covered many, and you
Not
know
that
many,
one.
but not that one. And it really was an election that tore us
Yeah.
apart in the heart and the depth of the Great War, where Canada had already lost about 35,000 killed at that point in the summer of 1917, as the election begins to get underway, and the work that will culminate in the election of December 1917. And it pitted, as you mentioned, English versus French, but farmers versus those in the cities, and workers against others.
Conservatives versus liberals.
That's right. Deep battlegrounds over an issue that went to the fundamental core of that war. And I think in so much in politics, we can often find compromise or the gray area or some agreement. But that election was about one thing: conscription.
Yeah.
Will we send and force young men to go and fight overseas in this war that some Canadians saw as an existential crisis? It had to be won. And which other Canadians said, well, not really. It's more of a European war. It doesn't really affect us. And there was just no bridging that. Either you're sending some soldiers, young men against their will, or you're not, because we'd already had about 500,000 soldiers enlist at that point. And we'd suffered those horrendous casualties. And yes, the poppy was a part of that in recruitment campaigns and what have you. And so it has always been a symbol that Canadians, and we often see this very much as a Canadian symbol because of John McCrae in the poem, even though, of course, it's Britain and France and Australia and the other dominions, or the old dominions, employ it, to a lesser extent, the United States. But it has always been charged with such emotions. And you see that throughout the 1920s. So after the poppy has been adopted, and veterans really see it as doing two things. One, as an object of remembrance and commemoration, right? The survivors had made a pact with the fallen to say, we would not forget you, lest we forget. And of course, in the 1920s was a period of great memorial building. We built thousands of memorials across this country. I imagine every single one of your listeners can think of a memorial in their hometown from the Great War.
The cenotaph in front of the Legion Hall in small town Canada.
That's right. Those
Yeah.
Legion halls, they
Yeah.
too were a form of memorials that sprang up across the country. In stained glass windows in churches, plaques outside of schools or in them, and businesses. Gardens that were planted to create a living space. The list goes on and on. Even war trophies brought back from overseas, captured German artillery pieces or machine guns, they were displayed prominently in Canadian cities, towns, and villages. And yet the poppy had a special resonance. So on the one hand, it was about remembrance. On the other hand, it was a fundraiser to help veterans move on with their lives. And of course, we had 66,000 Canadians who died in the war or in its immediate aftermath. But there were 170,000 Canadians wounded, about half of them grievously. Yeah. And one of the legacies, many legacies of the war, was the creation of a state hospital system to care for these veterans, but also the creation of those veterans. About 550,000 or so came home, and they were a powerful force. And so many of them were wounded in body, and increasingly it was revealed in spirit and in mind. I think we have a much greater sense today, Senator, of post-traumatic stress disorder. Right. It was not well known at the time, but it was revealed through individuals. And so the poppy was a way for the Legion from 1925 onwards, as it was established, to raise money for veterans. And those two things are still with us today.
Yeah, still very much with us today. And a better, as you say, understanding. I mean, I used to watch my father. Remembrance Day was a very big deal in our community and in our family. And when the veterans there was the service in the morning, and then there was a lunch, and then the men went downstairs and gathered and had a drink or two. but they didn't talk about the horror. They told their war stories, but the funny ones. And that was their own form of denial and their own form, I guess, of coping, because we didn't have anything to call it. We didn't have a name. We didn't have a category.
Yeah. I think when I was on your show last year, the year before, talked about my book, The Secret History of Soldiers, which
Right.
looked at how did soldiers cope and endure in the trenches. And I argued that they created a cultural shield to protect themselves, but it involved banding together. And we know that idea of the band of brothers and coming together. And one of the things we forget about with the Canadian Expeditionary Force, so there were 620,000 who served. They were English Canadians and French Canadians and New Canadians and Indigenous Canadians. And they came from across the country, in every city, every town, every village, every class, almost every religion. They came together. And in through the forge of war, they were forced to lean on each other. And we have testimony from Black Canadians and Indigenous Canadians saying they were accepted in the ranks. I wouldn't want to paint the picture that it was a multicultural society. It wasn't. It was different 100 years ago. And yet there were very strong bonds of comradeship that were forged in war. And so when those veterans came back, and they returned to all of their communities because they were citizen soldiers for the most part, not professionals, they slowly began to build up those networks, the kinship networks of fellow veterans. And they came together often in those Legion halls to talk, to share stories, to process the war. And of course, being a man is very different 100 years ago. It seemed quite clear that alcohol was a very important aspect of talking and dealing with these issues, but simply being around others who had experienced
Others who
those
got
same
it,
things.
who
They got
understood
it.
it. Yeah.
And that is often what those Legion halls did. And then I think in a more focused way, Remembrance Day, of course, as it was known from 1931 to the present, of course, before that as Armistice Day. And it too allowed veterans to come together in their communities to remember, to reflect upon, and perhaps to bear witness to those comrades who never came home.
The soldiers always believed in the cause, or at least most always believed in the cause, as you say, a war of liberation or a war against communism or whatever the battle of the day is in more current terms, against terrorism. But really, it's about that connection. They are there to have each other's backs. I have heard them say that in combat arenas where they just go, it's about having your six, it's about having your back. I'm there for my fellow soldiers, now men and women, not just the men, but that's what it's about. That's what keeps them connected.
I think it is. And I've been very lucky, as I know you have, to speak to veterans my whole adult life, veterans from the Great War, for me, Second World War, the Korean War, Cold War veterans, those who served in NATO or NORAD or peacekeeping missions, more recently, peacemaking operations or Afghanistan. And that is a constant that comes across the camaraderie, the importance of those small unit relations. And I've often been asked and tried to explore in my books, how do soldiers, airmen, nurses, sailors, all of our various combat arms, how do they do it? And of course, it's incredible training, leadership, very motivated men and women. And yet there is something very intangible there that that helps many to go forward in the face of fire.
And run toward it, not away from it. In one of the books you contributed to, called In Flanders Fields, actually, Romeo Dallaire writes about concepts like patriotism and having your fellow soldiers back. And he said he's not sure we any longer enjoy the unity of understanding. That was his phrase of what this means. It's hard today to understand the level of sacrifice and the nature of war. Today, it's so much more clinical in people's eyes. They watch it on movie screens, they watch it on TV. the reality of the Great War and World War II, that it's almost beyond comprehension.
It is. It can be difficult for us, we who have enjoyed the country and the world that they fought for, that they
Right.
gave to us, that we inherited. We who generally have not been touched directly by
Right.
war, save for many new Canadians who come here from war-torn
Yeah.
countries, and I think who find great sanctuary here, and a new life, and often great success. Um, there have always been men and women who have been called upon, I think, to go into harm's way, or to run into the fire, as you mentioned, or to serve and sacrifice. The two world wars are unique in our history because they involve massive citizen armies.
Right.
620,000 in the Great War, 1.1 million in the Second World War.
It's
Again,
staggering. It's
it's
just
staggering.
staggering. Yeah.
1 in 10 Canadians
Yeah.
in uniform. And if you think, listeners, of the 10 people you know, one of them being in uniform in that war, one
Yeah.
in 3 adult males, 50,000 women who served in the Second World War in uniform. Again, another staggering contribution. And those two world wars, they loom large in our memory, or they cast a dark shadow. We think of Canada being a nation of peacekeepers, of peacemakers. I'm very proud of how we contribute on the world stage, but we're also a country that's been shaped by war. There's just no
Yeah.
denying it.
Yeah.
Um,
And that's the thing, trying to keep that alive. As I mean, obviously your daughters have a sense of it. You're steeped in this. This is what you do. You're a historian and a military historian, so they know it. How do we keep this alive in other places with that lack of unity, of understanding, with the lack of experience? It doesn't touch us in the same way. I'm thinking today of, and I know you don't want to get into the politics of it, but our flag at half-mast and what we will do on Remembrance Day, what we see happening in Afghanistan with Afghan, they weren't really soldiers because they weren't armed at the beginning, but those translators and the people who ran the bases and the cooks, and leaving them behind without there being a real understanding of what a profound breach of promise that is. How can we educate and teach and make sure we keep this sense alive of what it means to serve, what it means to ask people to do that, and then what we in turn owe them?
it's a great question, and it's one I struggle with as a historian, as a writer. I'm very lucky, as you know, to work at the Canadian War Museum. I've been there
Right.
for 20 years, and you'll remember the old War Museum. I grew up in Ottawa, and I love that old museum, but it
Yeah.
never changed. The new museum from 2005 to the present, we welcome, before COVID at least, about 500,000 people a year, and that's quite a staggering number. And
Yeah.
I always feel heartened by that. The people who come in, and they're not just people like me, middle-aged men, families and young people, and about a third of our visitors are school children, and bus tours. And I don't want to sound like I'm spouting propaganda here, but there is something quite central about the War
Yeah.
Museum in sharing these stories. But it can't just be the War Museum. In my book, The Fight for History, which we talked about last year, which looks at the memory of the Second World War, and where I, having studied military history for 25 years, and I always found it strange that we didn't do a better job in telling our stories of the Second World
Mhm.
War. Those 1.1 million Canadians we were talking about, Canadians fighting around the world in multiple land campaigns, on the oceans, in the air, defending North America with the United States, defending other countries, laying down our lives to liberate the French, the Belgians, the Dutch. And yet most Canadians probably have no idea what happened during the Battle of the Atlantic, the 100,000 Canadians who served in the Royal Canadian Navy. And most could not tell you that almost 100,000 Canadians served in the Italian campaign, or fought to liberate, Europe. And I struggled with that. And I argue in the book that The Fight for History, that for about 50 years, we just really ignored our history. We didn't tell our stories. And I know, Senator, you're such a great proponent of telling our story,
Yeah, yeah,
of addressing our history, the good and the bad. And
exactly. It is our history. It's our story.
that's right.
Yeah,
And as I argued, it was very clear to me that we didn't write the same history books, and we didn't write the novels or create the plays, or we didn't have documentaries, and we didn't have the feature films, and we didn't build a national memorial. And I talked about that in the fight for history, of
yeah,
how
yeah,
when veterans came back in 1945, they had accepted the prominence of Remembrance Day and the poppy and 2 minutes of silence, and coming together. And yet there was a great debate where they argued with the government of the day, Mackenzie King's Liberals. They said, we accept all these things, but we want our own national memorial. The First World War Memorial, or our national memorial in downtown Ottawa, erected in 1939, has those 22 First World War figures passing through it. And they said, it's wonderful, but it's linked to the Great War.
yeah,
And the government of the day said no. And I argue that that diminished our story, along with all those other things. And ultimately, I argued in the book, if we don't tell our history, if we don't tell our stories, don't expect the Americans or the French or the British to do it for us. Right?
right.
We're a grown-up country. We need to tell our stories with honesty and truth, and to address the horrors and the heroics, the service and the sacrifice. But our great enemy is apathy. Our great enemy is silence.
Yeah,
And I think we've done a better job, Senator, over the last 25 years. I think Canadians have clued in that we are a country that is both of peacekeepers, but also of warriors, that has a military history, that has veterans, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, who live amongst us. And yet, I think that there remains an ongoing, as I call it in the book, a
yeah.
fight against that apathy. And I think Remembrance Day is at least one day. We should have more, but it is at least one day, or the lead up to it, where we can reflect upon what those Canadians have done in the past, and what they continue to do, and what they likely will do going forward into the future.
Because that's what troubles me with all of these symbolic gestures, and there's too many of them these days, that it diminishes the importance of this, that it becomes a day off from work or a day off from school, or maybe not even important enough to be a day off from work. There are parts of this country that Remembrance Day, if you're at the office, you check your watch, it might be 11 o'clock, even if you remember that much. We need a more concerted effort. And when we have leadership at senior levels that have no experience with this, it's hard to see how they're going to give the proper time and due respect to the history that it represents. And again, the flag issue is a prime example of the debate there we're unfortunately not having in this country about our history.
Yeah, history can be a tough sell.
Yeah,
I've always said
a
that.
good way to put it.
It is. It doesn't typically get people charged up, although I think in the last 5 or 10 years we have seen how it can really strike deep passions. And I think for those who want to change history and demand a change in the way we talk about the past, and those who also reflect on and say, well, I understand there may be deep hurt or passion about a particular topic, and yet we must talk about the good and the bad, as we have been saying.
Yeah,
And I think there's no easy solution here. And I think for listeners, even if they're listening now and reflecting on this, I think that's a useful thing, to be reminded of this contested nature of the past, which plays out in our present. And I think every country, to some degree, is going through this. It's a really interesting time. And it's not always connected to war and military history. Of course, we know questions of Indigenous history and reconciliation are front and center in much of our public discourse. But I like to reflect, at least on Remembrance Day, of what we can do about our shared military history and its importance to us as Canadians, to better understand why it still matters to us. Why does it matter that 1.1 million Canadians served in the Second World War, in the fight against fascism, in a war, as I have called it, a necessary war that they believed in? And for the most part, I think when we reflect on it today, that we still believe it. It was a war against Hitler and the Nazis that had to be won. And yet, we must do a better job in teaching it, in exploring these things. I guess if there's any solace, and I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, and my
Yeah.
three daughters, we've spoken about them. They've passed through multiple schools. Every year they have Remembrance Day ceremonies. My grandfather, who's
I'm so glad that still happens. It does in my hometown too.
yeah, and I do think the teachers and the students, they do a much better job. They make sure that these stories are told and that there's an understanding, and there's interesting movements in smaller towns. I have heard there's a Lest We Forget program where teachers take their students to the local cenotaph and the names of the fallen there, and then they can go to the Library Archives Canada and look at personnel files and who was that,
Yeah.
who was John Smith. And I remember one trip years ago driving through Prince Edward Island and stopping at every small town and village and seeing a cenotaph, sometimes just to 4 soldiers,
Yeah.
sometimes to 6, sometimes to 9. And with my daughters talking about it and just reflecting on what would it mean to lose 4 young men from this community of 100 houses. It was utterly devastating. And I think we have maybe a better sense today, having lived through the pandemic and the loss there, of what mass death and grief can do. And yet, as I think you have said eloquently, we can probably never fully understand the full effects of war and grief and loss, and to have lived through 6 years of the Second World War, to pick
Yeah.
one primary example, and its impact on almost every Canadian family in this country.
We at the Legion, of which I am a member in Wadena, and my sister is the president. This year, we're doing the banner project, where on the same poles that you see the Christmas lights or whatever it may be, are banners of our veterans through all of the battles. And the response was unbelievable when families were giving an opportunity to have their grandfather or their father or brother recognized and remembered. So it's somewhere deep in our heart and deep in our soul, and we just have to find ways so people can express it.
Well, I think your mention of the banner project is really, really important just for people to reflect on, because it's about the people, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's about seeing their faces. It's about knowing that when I say 66,000 dead from the Great War, that's one of them. That was someone's son or brother or daughter or whatever the case, and they had loved ones. To return to John McCrae, loved
Yes.
and were loved, and now
Yeah.
we lie in Flanders fields. And we can think about that for the Second World War, for the Korean War, for Canadians lost during the Cold War, for Canadians who fell during the Afghanistan War.
Yeah.
And it is a constant. And I believe in Ottawa, the books of remembrance that mark those fallen Canadians, they number and contain over 118,000 names. And that is a staggering figure. If we were to think of 118,000 banners, to see their faces and to think about the Silver Cross mothers
Yeah.
and the next of kin and the widows and the orphans, and to think that it's not just the loss of one life, it is how that affects a family or a community or ultimately a country. And those are some of the things that I have found at the Canadian War Museum that resonate with our visitors, old, middle-aged, and young, to talk about the people.
And see those faces. Tim Cook, it's always so great to talk with you, and I thank you for everything you do to keep this part of our story alive and real and present for all the generations today and the ones that will follow. It's wonderful work, and thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
We're going to go out today with, of course, the words or the poem In Flanders Fields, recited by poet and musician, the late Leonard Cohen. So take a look and take a listen to the visuals, to the voice, and take that moment to remember.
In Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.